Good morning. I will start with racial formation and the May 1st movement. Today I'm going to talk about the May 1st movement, the lens of racial formation theory. The May 1st movement is usually remembered as a culture or intellectual awakening. It's a moment like when Chinese students and intellectual called for science, democracy, and national renewal. But my argument is that it was also something else. It was a racial project. I argue that during this moment of crisis, Chinese intellectual re-articulated Chinese identity by like drawing on ideas of race, ethnicity, gender, and class. So, under the pressure of imperialism and um, global racial hierarchies, idea like the yellow race, the Chinese nation, women's emancipation, and even like who could speak for the nation became like a deeply connected to question of modernity and survival. So this rearticulation was very powerful. It successfully reshaped cultural meanings and I would say like redefined what it meant to be modern and Chinese. But it also had clear limits. So while like the culture and identity were transformed, deeper structure, inequality, and like especially along class lines, was like remained unresolved. And in this oral presentation, I will use a racial formation theory to show both the uh, our achievements and contradictions of like the May 1st movement, and then how like actually it help us understand race beyond the purely Western context. So, before getting into the May 1st movement itself, I want to briefly explain like what racial formation theory is. So since it's like the main framework I'm working on, according to Omi and Winant, race is not biological or natural. So like instead, race is socially constructed. It's produced through history, political struggle, and the system of like power. Even though like race isn't based in biology, it still has a very real like consequence in people's life. The first key concept is racialization, as we learned this in class. This refers to the process of giving social meaning to physical or cultural differences. The certain traits like the skin color, language, dress, or even like the idea. So come to stands for like deeper assumptions about who belongs, who's modern, or who's like dangerous. So the second concept is racial project. Racial project are the ways these like racial meanings move beyond the idea and get built into institutions, laws, and everyday like practices. So they connected how race is understood culturally with how power and resources are distributed materially. Finally, when racial projects operate together over time, they uh produce like racial formation. It's a system like where racial meanings start to feel natural or like common sense, even though like they were uh created through racial and political processes. So I will use this framework to show how the May First movement wasn't just about culture or idea, but about actively reshaping social meanings and power relations in the moment of national crisis. So, applying racial formation theory to the May Fourth movement, this is where racial formation theory become especially, I would say, useful for understanding the May Fourth movement. So at the time, Chinese intellectuals were deeply aware of global racial hierarchies produced by imperialism. They often frame the uh, world politics through contrasts like the yellow race versus like the white race, borrowing racial languages to make sense of China's position in the modern world. So race was therefore mobilized as an explanation for national weakness, Chinese political and economic sub subordination, I would say. I don't know if like this word is accurate, was not only like understand as a military or technological problem, but as like a racial problem, a sign that the nation had been positioned as like an inferior within like a global racial order. So as a result, modernity itself became like a racialized, became like modern. It was not just about adopting new ideas or technologies. It was also about like proving that China could stand as equal to Western power. Science, democracy, education, and cultural reform were framed as a tool for racial and national survival. So, in this way, the May First movement functioned as a racial project. It redefined what it meant to be Chinese by linking cultural reform, political renewal, and identity to global racial meanings. This is why racial formation theory fits with kids so naturally. It really helped us see how like the ideas, power, and identity were being reshaped at the same time, I would say. And race in the May 4th period also intersect very clearly with ethnicity. What's important to understand is that like the idea of a unified Chinese nation. In Chinese, we say it's 中华民族 was not a natural or timeless identity. It's it was something like actively constructed at a moment of crisis under imperial pressure. Chinese intellectuals were trying to figure out how to hold a fragmented society together while facing a world structured by racial hierarchies. So, in this context, ethnicity was reshaped for a political purpose. Intellectual promoted the idea of single Chinese nation that could unite Han people and minorities into one collective subject capable of resisting foreign domination. So this wasn't just about shared culture or traditions. Oh, it was about like survival. So ethnicity here function as a political project. It defined who belonged to the nation, who could speak for it, and how like the internal differences should be managed in the time of national strengths. And this is where racial formation theory helps again. It allows us to see ethnicity not as something fixed or cultural, but as something produced through power, crisis, and global racial pressure. In this case, ethnicity was not about celebrating diversity. It was about like producing unity under like the conditions of uh racialized racialized threat. So race during the May 1st period also intersected strongly with gender. One of the most visible symbol of movement was the figure of the new woman. Women's education, free choice in marriage, and um, and participation in public life were celebrated as like a sign that China was becoming more like modern and strong. So these reforms were not framed mainly as individual rights, but as national necessities, I would say. Gender reforms was also deeply tied to racial comparison with the West. So reformers often contrasted China with Western nations and argued that a modern civilized society require education and liberated women. So in this way, women's status became a measure of China's position within global racial hierarchies. So as a result, women's body became sites of modernization. How women dress, studied, married, and behaved came to symbolize whether the nation itself was progressing or failing behind. This shows that the gender here was not just a culture issue. It was part of like a broader racial project. Gender reform helped re-articulate Chinese identity by linking womanhood to national strengths, racial equalities, and modernity. So through those like racial formation theory, we can see how like the gender was socially constructed in response to a global power and racial pressure. So race during the May 1st movement also intersect with class as well. And this helps explain both in power and its limit. The movement was led primarily by students and intellectuals, many of whom came from urban, educated background. They function as an emerging bourgeoisie intellectual positioning like themselves as the moral or cultural leader of the nation. They call for science, democracy, and culture in Europe reflected this social position. Thus, the movement expanded, workers and shopkeepers also became involved, especially through strikes and boycotts. However, their participation also centered on material concern like wages, working condition, and economic survival, rather than like a cultural reform like a law. This creates a tension between cultural weakening and material inequality. Well, intellectual emphasis, symbolic transformation, and national identity. Many workers face immediate economic hardship that um, those culture change did not like directly address. So, like in this sense, class limited how far like the racial rearticulation could go. The movement successfully reshaped how China was imagined and it struggled to translate culture transformation into material equality. I would say, like this helps explain why the May 1st movement achieved lasting culture influences, yet left deeper class inequalities unresolved. So one of the clearest way to see the impact of the May 1st movement is also to look at how was socially re-articulated. In other words, what meaning changed. So first, Confucian tradition was reframed for sure. Practices and value that had once been treated as the foundation of social order were increasingly described as backward and incompatible with modern life. This was not just a criticism of like past, but like it's also a redefinition of like what counted as progress. The second, science and democracy were re-articulated as necessities rather than foreign idea. They became central symbol of national survival, tied to China's ability to stand equally with Western power in a racialized global order. And I would say third, popular protest itself was redefined. Students, demonstrations, strikes, and boycott were no longer seen simply as a disorder or a rebellion. So, but like as a legitimate forms of political participation. Ordinary people began to see collective action as a valid way to pressure the state together. Like those shifts show how the May 1st movement successfully reshaped culture and political common sense. It did not just introduce new idea, it changed how people understand tradition, modernity, and political action within Chinese society. So despite its cultural power, the May 1st movement also had clear limits and internal contradictions. There was no stable democratic political outcome, while the movement promoting democracy as an ideal. It did not succeed in creating durable political institutions. The period that followed was marked by warlordism and continued instabilities rather than democratic consolidation. So second, like the movement produced competing ideological vision rather than a unified program. Liberalism, socialism, anarchism, and later Marxism also emerged from the same in, in intellectual opening, but they pointed China's future in like a very different direction. This ideological fragmentation limit the moment's ability to translate culture critique into coordinated political change. And most importantly, the May 1st movement achieved culture rearticulation with deep structural transformation. It changed how people thought about traditions, identity, and modernity, but it did not fundamentally transform class relations or um, material inequalities. So, in this sense, like the movement opened the doors to modernity, but it could not decide who would walk through it or on what terms. That like a unresolved question would be taken up by later political force in very different ways. So rather than offered a specific policy solutions, the May 1st movement offered broader sociological lessons about social change. First, It shows that culture change does not automatically produce structural inequality. Even when identities and values are successfully re-articulated, materials, inequalities, and power relations can remain largely untouched. And second, like this case reminds us that the race cannot be analyzed in isolation. Race has to be examined alongside class and material conditions. Well, racial and national identity can powerfully mobilize movements that fall to address like the inequality often reach their limits. Finally, like the May 1st movement highlights that social movement require both symbolic and material strategies. Culture transformation can open political possibilities, but lasting change depends on connecting identities, ideology, and everyday material life. So in that sense, like the solution the May 1st movement point to is not a specific policy, but a lesson about how social movement needed to connect culture change with material redistribution. So to conclude, looking at the May 1st movement through racial formation theory help us see it in a new way. It was not only a cultural or intellectual awakening, but a racial project shaped by power, crisis, and global inequalities. The movement successfully rearticulated Chinese identity, redefining tradition, modernity, and political participation. It changed how people understood what it meant to be Chinese in a visualized world. So at the same time, its limit were structural. Culture transformation did not automatically lead to material equalities, my bad, and the class inequalities remains largely unresolved. So ultimately, the May 1st movement show us that racial formation is not just a Western phenomenon, and that identity-based movements can be powerful, but without structural change, rearticulation alone is never enough. Thank you.